What happens when you finally trust God completely? Maybe the real question is, what happens when you stop trying to carry a future that has been crushing your soul for years? Because you pray, but your mind still races. You ask God for peace, while secretly preparing yourself for everything to fall apart. And the most exhausting part is pretending you're okay, while fear quietly controls your every thought. You love God, but deep inside, you still feel like everything depends on you. Like if you stop overthinking for one moment, your whole life could collapse. But what if the reason you feel so tired is because you were never meant to hold all of this alone? And what if the peace you've been begging God for only begins the moment you finally let go? You believe in God, you pray, you're trying to stay faithful. But deep inside, there is still a constant pressure living in your mind that never seems to fully leave. It follows you into quiet moments. It waits for you at night. It interrupts your prayers. Even when everything around you looks stable, your thoughts still prepare for something to go wrong. And maybe that is what has exhausted you the most. Not only the problems themselves, but the endless mental weight of carrying them. The overthinking, the emotional tension, the constant need to figure everything out before something falls apart. You tell yourself you are being responsible, careful, wise, prepared. But if you are honest, much of what you call responsibility has actually become fear, wearing a reasonable disguise, because your mind rarely rests anymore. Even while praying, part of you is still trying to control the outcome. Even while asking God for help, another part of you is already planning backup solutions in case God does not respond the way you hope. You want to trust Him completely, but your thoughts keep pulling you back into anxiety, back into self-protection, back into the exhausting belief that if you stop holding everything together, your entire life may collapse. And slowly, without even realizing it, peace became unfamiliar. You still love God. You still believe He is real. But somewhere along the way, your inner world became dominated by pressure instead of rest. You started waking up already, mentally tired. Conversations became heavier. Waiting became unbearable. Silence from God started feeling personal. You began wondering things you do not always say out loud. Why does trusting God feel so difficult? Why does fear still feel stronger than faith sometimes? Why do you pray for peace while your mind continues racing? And maybe one of the hardest questions of all is this: if God is truly in control, why does your heart still feel like it must carry everything alone? That tension can quietly break a person from the inside, because the deepest exhaustion is not always physical. Sometimes it is spiritual and emotional. It is the fatigue that comes from trying to trust God while secretly depending completely on yourself. It is carrying emotional burdens your soul was never designed to hold. You were never created to predict every outcome. You were never meant to survive by controlling every possibility. And yet many people spend years doing exactly that, trying to think their way into peace, trying to worry their way into certainty, trying to control their way into security. But none of those things ever truly calm the heart, because control may temporarily reduce uncertainty, but it never produces lasting peace. In fact, control often becomes its own prison. The more you try to manage everything, the more afraid you become of losing control. And the more afraid you become, the more your thoughts spiral. Suddenly your mind is constantly scanning the future for danger. Every unanswered prayer feels threatening. Every delay feels suspicious. Every closed door feels like proof that something is going wrong. And eventually, even faith starts feeling heavy. Not because God became distant, but because fear became loud. That is what many people misunderstand about spiritual struggle. Sometimes the greatest battle is not happening around you. It is happening inside you, in your thoughts, in your expectations, in the silent pressure you place on yourself every single day. You may look calm externally, while internally carrying panic no one sees. You may smile while secretly feeling emotionally overwhelmed. You may continue functioning while your mind quietly lives in survival mode. And after a while, this becomes so normal that you forget what true rest even feels like. But deep down, your soul knows something is wrong. Because no matter how hard you try, you cannot think yourself into peace. You cannot achieve enough control to finally feel safe. there will always be another uncertainty, another fear, another unknown future waiting beyond your current situation. And maybe that is why your anxiety has never fully disappeared, because the problem was never only the situation itself. Maybe the deeper issue is that you have been trying to carry a weight only God was meant to carry. That realization is uncomfortable, because part of you still believes your constant mental effort is helping you survive. You tell yourself that if you stop worrying, you will become careless. If you stop overthinking, you will miss something important. If you stop trying to control outcomes, everything will become unstable. But has control truly given you peace? Or has it only made you more emotionally tired? That question matters more than most people realize, because many believers spend years asking God for peace while refusing to release the fear that is stealing it. They want God to calm their anxiety without surrendering the control feeding their anxiety. But trust and control cannot sit on the throne of your heart at the same time. One will always overpower the other, and this is where the internal conflict becomes painful. You trust God with your eternity, but struggle to trust Him with your tomorrow. You believe He is faithful, but still panic when answers are delayed. You pray for guidance, but become anxious when you do not immediately understand what God is doing. And without realizing it, your relationship with God slowly becomes more transactional than relational. You feel close to Him when circumstances improve. You feel distant from Him when life becomes uncertain. You feel strong in faith when answers arrive quickly. You feel abandoned when heaven feels silent. But what if trust was never supposed to depend on emotional certainty? What if real faith begins exactly where control ends? That possibility changes everything, because most people assume trust in God should feel emotionally comfortable from the beginning. They think surrender should instantly produce confidence and clarity. But often the opposite happens first. When you finally begin releasing control, fear becomes louder before it becomes weaker. Your mind resists surrender because it has spent years believing control equals safety. And that is why trusting God completely can feel terrifying at first. Not because God is untrustworthy, but because fear has trained your mind to survive through control. That training runs deep. It shapes your reactions, your emotions, your prayers, your expectations, even the way you interpret silence. When answers do not come quickly, fear immediately starts creating explanations. Maybe God forgot you. Maybe you failed. Maybe nothing will change. Maybe things will only get worse. And slowly, your thoughts begin speaking louder than truth. That is why so many people feel spiritually exhausted even while remaining faithful outwardly. They are fighting invisible mental battles every day. Battles nobody else sees. Battles between fear and trust, between surrender and self-protection, between resting in God and trying to manage life alone. And the hardest part is that sometimes you do not even realize how heavy your inner world has become until you finally stop and examine it honestly. What would change inside you if you stopped trying to carry your entire future alone? Would you finally feel peace? Would fear lose its grip? Would waiting become easier? Would silence stop feeling so threatening? Or would surrender expose just how dependent you have become on control? Because maybe the reason trust feels difficult is not because God has failed you. Maybe it is because somewhere along the way, control became your source of emotional security. And until that changes, your soul will continue feeling divided between faith and fear. But there is something important you are beginning to see. Now, the exhaustion you feel is not weakness. It is evidence that you were never meant to live this way. Your soul was not created to carry tomorrow before it arrives. And maybe the reason God has allowed this tension to become so visible is because He wants to show you something you could never learn while depending entirely on yourself. Because sometimes God allows your strength to fail so you'll finally discover what it means to rest in His. And that raises a question that changes the direction of everything. What if the peace you have been searching for does not come from gaining more control, but from finally surrendering it? Fear rarely introduces itself honestly. Most of the time, it does not walk into your life announcing itself as fear. It arrives disguised as responsibility, as caution, as preparation, as the need to stay ahead of problems before they happen. And because it looks reasonable on the surface, you do not immediately recognize what it is doing to your soul. You simply call it being careful. But over Chimi, that carefulness slowly becomes emotional captivity. You begin carrying conversations in your head before they happen. You rehearse possible failures. You anticipate disappointment before receiving answers. You struggle to stay present because your mind constantly lives somewhere in the future, trying to protect you from pain that has not even arrived. And eventually, anxiety starts feeling normal. Not peaceful normal, not healthy normal, just familiar. You become so accustomed to mental pressure that silence feels uncomfortable. Rest feels irresponsible. Stillness makes you nervous because slowing down gives your thoughts room to surface, so you stay busy mentally, constantly analyzing, constantly planning, constantly trying to reduce uncertainty. But beneath all of that activity is something deeper. Fear, not always dramatic fear, sometimes quiet fear, sophisticated fear, religious fear, functional fear. The fear that if you do not hold everything together, things will fall apart. And what makes this struggle even more difficult is that fear often disguises itself as wisdom. You convince yourself that overthinking is helping you stay prepared. That worrying proves you care deeply. That mentally carrying every possible outcome makes you responsible. But if worry truly created peace, you would already have peace by now. Instead, your thoughts have only become heavier because fear never stays small when it is constantly fed attention. The mind naturally moves toward whatever it rehearses most. And if your thoughts continuously rehearse danger, disappointment, uncertainty, and worst-case scenarios, eventually your emotions begin responding to imagined futures as though they are already real. That is why anxiety can feel so overwhelming even before anything happens. Your body reacts to fear. Your mind keeps repeating. And this slowly changes the way you experience life. You stop enjoying the present because your thoughts live in tomorrow. You stop resting because your mind stays alert for problems. You stop feeling emotionally safe because uncertainty feels threatening. Even your relationship with God begins suffering under the weight of constant fear. Not necessarily because you stop believing in Him, but because fear changes how you interpret everything. Delays feel personal. Silence feels suspicious. Waiting feels dangerous. And somewhere deep inside, a painful belief quietly begins forming. If I do not stay mentally in control, something bad will happen. That belief becomes exhausting because now your peace depends entirely on your ability to predict, manage, and prevent every possible problem. And no human being can carry that responsibility without eventually collapsing emotionally. This is why so many people who appear strong externally feel deeply tired internally. They are carrying invisible pressure every day. Pressure to hold their future together. Pressure to avoid mistakes. Pressure to maintain stability. Pressure to understand what God is doing before they can feel secure. And yet, no amount of pressure ever produces true peace, because peace was never meant to come from control. That truth can feel difficult to accept because control creates the illusion of safety. It gives temporary emotional relief. Planning feels productive. Overthinking feels proactive. Worry feels like preparation. But underneath it all, fear is still driving the process. And fear always demands more. More certainty, more reassurance, more clarity, more guarantees. But life does not offer guarantees, and neither does faith. Faith has always required trust in the middle of uncertainty. That is what makes trust so difficult sometimes. Your emotions want evidence before surrender. Your mind wants explanations before peace. Your fear wants guarantees before rest. But God often asks you to trust Him before any of those things appear. And this is where many people become spiritually conflicted, because part of them genuinely wants to trust God, while another part keeps depending entirely on human control for emotional security. They pray for God to lead them, but internally resist any situation where they cannot fully predict the outcome. That tension slowly drains the soul. You start feeling emotionally divided. One side of you says, God is faithful. The other side whispers, but what if everything still falls apart? One side says, trust God. The other says, you need to stay in control. And the exhausting part is, that both voices can sound convincing, especially after disappointment, especially after pain, especially after seasons where prayers seemed unanswered. Because fear grows strongest where trust once felt painful. Sometimes people become controlling not because they are arrogant, but because they are wounded. They learn through difficult experiences that uncertainty feels unsafe. So now they try to protect themselves emotionally by managing everything they can. But eventually, the protection itself becomes the prison. Because the more control becomes your source of security, the more terrified you become of losing it. And that fear affects everything. Your sleep, your emotions, your relationships, your spiritual life, even your ability to hear God clearly. Fear creates noise inside the mind, and noisy thoughts make it difficult to rest in truth. This is why many believers know Scripture intellectually, but still struggle emotionally. They know God is trustworthy in theory, but fear still dominates their internal reactions. Their thoughts move faster than their faith. And perhaps that is where you have been living recently, not without faith, but with exhausted faith. Faith buried underneath overthinking. Faith competing against constant worry. Faith struggling to breathe beneath emotional pressure. And maybe part of you feels ashamed of that. You wonder why trusting God feels easier for other people. You wonder why your mind keeps returning to fear, even after praying. You wonder why peace feels temporary, while anxiety feels automatic. But transformation often begins when you stop pretending everything inside you is fine. Because healing requires honesty. And honesty says this: you are tired, not only physically, mentally tired, emotionally tired, spiritually tired, tired of carrying burdens you cannot control, tired of fearing the future, tired of needing constant reassurance, tired of trying to hold your entire life together alone. And maybe the most important realization is this: your constant worry has not actually protected you. It has only exhausted you. Think about how many fears never happened. How many scenarios your mind created that never became reality. How many sleepless nights changed absolutely nothing. Fear promises protection, but usually produces paralysis. It convinces you that if you worry enough, you can somehow prevent pain. But worry cannot control tomorrow. It only steals strength from today. And deep down, you already know this. That is why your soul feels restless. Because part of you understands you were created for something deeper than survival mode. You were created for relationship with God, not endless emotional self-protection. But relationship requires trust. Real trust, not selective trust. Not temporary trust. Not trust only when life feels understandable. Trust that continues even when emotions feel unstable. And this is where something inside you begins shifting. You start realizing that your greatest problem may not actually be your circumstances. Maybe the deeper issue is that fear has been discipling your thoughts more than truth has. Fear has been teaching you how to interpret delays, how to interpret silence, how to interpret uncertainty, how to interpret waiting. And the result is emotional exhaustion. But what if God never intended your mind to function this way? What if peace was never supposed to come from controlling life, but from trusting the one who already holds it? That idea sounds comforting until surrender becomes necessary. Because surrender means releasing the illusion that you can secure your future through anxiety. And that feels terrifying at first, not because God is unsafe, but because fear trained you to believe control is necessary for survival. So now you stand between two different ways of living. One path continues the cycle of fear, overthinking, and emotional striving. The other requires surrender before clarity fully arrives. One keeps you mentally exhausted. The other asks you to trust God even while uncertainty still exists. And the truth is, you cannot fully walk in peace while secretly building your life around fear. Something has to change internally, not just externally, internally. Because God is not only interested in changing your circumstances, He is deeply concerned with transforming the condition of your heart and mind. And sometimes the first step toward peace is finally admitting that control has never truly healed your fear. It has only hidden it. But if that is true, then another question begins rising to the surface. If fear and control cannot produce peace? Why does God sometimes allow seasons where you have no choice but to wait? Waiting exposes what control tries to hide. As long as answers come quickly, it is easy to believe your faith is strong. As long as doors open, prayers are answered, and life moves according to your expectations, trust can feel natural. But the real condition of the heart often becomes visible in seasons where nothing changes immediately, where prayers seem unanswered, where clarity does not come, where God feels silent. And those seasons can feel deeply unsettling, because silence forces you to confront something most people spend years avoiding: the inability to control what happens next. That is why waiting feels so emotionally intense sometimes. It is not only about the situation itself, it is about what uncertainty awakens inside you. Fear rises, doubts surface, questions become louder. You begin wondering whether God is listening at all. And perhaps one of the most painful parts is that spiritual silence can feel deeply personal. When heaven seems quiet, your mind naturally tries to explain why. Maybe God is disappointed in you. Maybe your faith is too weak. Maybe you made the wrong decision. Maybe God has abandoned you. Maybe nothing will ever change. The human mind struggles with silence because silence leaves room for fear to speak. And fear speaks quickly. It fills empty spaces with assumptions. It interprets delay as rejection. It interprets uncertainty as danger. It interprets waiting as proof that something is wrong. But what if silence does not mean absence? What if God is still working in ways your emotions cannot currently recognize? That possibility changes how you see waiting completely, because most people assume God is only active when visible progress appears. They believe movement equals presence and delay equals distance. But throughout life, some of the deepest transformations happen invisibly before anything changes externally. Roots grow in hidden places first, and the same is often true spiritually. God frequently works beneath the surface long before visible answers appear. But because the human heart craves immediate reassurance, waiting can feel unbearable. You want certainty now, relief now, direction now. Yet many times, God does not immediately remove uncertainty. Instead, He teaches you how to trust Him inside it. That process can feel frustrating because your natural instinct is to escape discomfort as quickly as possible. You want the problem solved, so your emotions can finally settle. You tell yourself, once this situation changes, then I will have peace. But what happens when the situation does not change immediately? What happens when the prayer remains unanswered longer than expected? What happens when God does not explain Himself? This is where many people become spiritually exhausted, not because God stopped working, but because they expected trust to eliminate uncertainty completely. Yet trust has never depended on full understanding. In fact, real trust often begins exactly where understanding ends. And that is difficult for the human mind to accept, because your mind naturally wants control through clarity. You want to know where life is going? You want reassurance that everything will work out exactly the way you hope? You want visible confirmation before you can relax emotionally. But God rarely gives the entire picture at once. Instead, He often gives enough light for the next step, and that can feel uncomfortable when your fear wants the entire future explained immediately. Maybe that is where you are right now. You are asking God for answers, but He seems quiet. You are asking for clarity, but uncertainty remains. You are asking for immediate relief, but the waiting continues. And if you are not careful, waiting can slowly distort the way you see God. You may begin believing His silence means indifference. You may start assuming delay means rejection. You may conclude that unanswered prayers are evidence of abandonment. But silence and absence are not the same thing. A parent can remain silent while still being present. A teacher can remain quiet during a test while still watching carefully. And God can appear silent while still actively shaping something deeper inside you. The problem is that fear interprets silence emotionally instead of spiritually. Fear says, God is not doing anything. Faith whispers, something may be happening that I cannot yet see. That tension becomes the battlefield, especially because waiting exposes the true condition of trust. When life feels uncertain, you begin discovering where your security actually comes from. If your peace completely disappears whenever clarity disappears, then perhaps your peace was rooted more in certainty than in God Himself. That realization can feel painful because many people unknowingly build their emotional stability around outcomes instead of God's character. They feel secure when circumstances look hopeful and fearful when circumstances become unclear. But circumstances constantly change. God's character does not. And learning that difference changes everything. Because eventually, God begins teaching you that peace cannot survive if it depends entirely on external certainty. Real peace must become rooted in something deeper than visible outcomes, deeper than emotions, deeper than timing, deeper than immediate answers. Otherwise, your emotional life will always rise and fall with circumstances. And perhaps that is exactly what God is trying to heal inside you now. Not simply the situation itself, but the fragile foundation underneath your peace. Because if your security depends on having all the answers, life will constantly feel unstable. There will always be another unknown, another delay, another situation you cannot fully control. But if your security becomes rooted in God's faithfulness instead of your understanding, something inside you begins changing. Even before circumstances improve, you stop demanding immediate explanations for everything. You stop treating uncertainty like an emergency. You stop assuming silence means disaster. And slowly, waiting begins transforming you instead of destroying you. That transformation is rarely instant. At first, waiting feels uncomfortable because it exposes how addicted the mind has become to certainty. You realize how much emotional energy has been spent trying to predict outcomes. You notice how quickly fear rises whenever answers are delayed. But over Chimi, something deeper begins happening. You start recognizing that your survival was never actually dependent on your ability to control life perfectly. God has sustained you through seasons you once thought would destroy you. Think about that honestly. There were moments you believed you would not recover emotionally, moments you thought would completely break you, moments where the future looked uncertain and frightening. Yet somehow you are still here, still breathing, still standing, still being carried forward. Not because you managed everything perfectly, but because God remained faithful. Even when your emotions struggled to trust Him fully, that realization begins softening something inside you. You start understanding that waiting is not always punishment. Sometimes, waiting is preparation. Preparation for deeper trust. Preparation for spiritual maturity. Preparation for freedom from dependence on control. Because as painful as waiting feels, it reveals things prosperity and comfort often hide. It reveals fears you did not know were controlling you. It exposes emotional dependence, uncertainty. It uncovers how much of your peace has been connected to outcomes instead of God. And although that exposure feels uncomfortable, it is also deeply necessary. Because healing begins where truth becomes visible. And maybe the truth becoming visible right now is this. You have spent years trying to avoid uncertainty instead of learning how to trust God inside it. But life with God was never designed to remove every unknown future immediately. Faith has always involved walking forward without possessing complete understanding. That does not mean your questions are wrong. Questions are human. Even strong believers wrestle internally during difficult seasons. Even faithful people sometimes struggle with silence. Trust does not mean you never feel confused. It means confusion no longer becomes your master. And perhaps that is the deeper invitation hidden inside waiting, not simply to endure uncertainty, but to discover God differently within it. Because when immediate answers disappear, you begin learning whether your relationship with God is built only on outcomes or on trust in His character, and that changes the relationship completely. You stop approaching God merely to gain reassurance about the future. You begin seeking Him because He Himself becomes your peace. That shift takes time. But once it begins happening, fear slowly loses some of its authority. Not because every question has been answered, not because uncertainty suddenly disappears, but because your confidence slowly stops depending on visible certainty. And still, one painful struggle remains. Even if waiting has purpose, even if God is still present in silence, Why is surrendering control still so difficult? Surrender sounds beautiful in theory until it becomes personal. It is easy to say, trust God completely, when life feels stable. But when uncertainty enters your life, surrender suddenly feels much more costly. Because surrender is not only spiritual language, it is emotional release. It is letting go of the belief that your constant effort can secure your future. And that is where the struggle becomes deeply internal. Part of you wants peace, but another part still wants control. You want rest, but you also want guarantees. You want God to lead, but you still want to know exactly where He is taking you before you fully relax emotionally. And if you are honest, that need for certainty has shaped many of your reactions for years. You have tried to prepare for every possibility, protect yourself from every disappointment, predict every outcome before it arrives. Not because you're weak, but because somewhere deep inside, control started feeling safer than trust. That happens quietly, usually after pain, after disappointment, after unanswered prayers, after seasons where life felt unstable. The heart slowly learns to protect itself emotionally through control. You'll begin believing that if you stay mentally ahead of problems, you can avoid being hurt again. So your mind remains constantly active, constantly alert, constantly managing possibilities. But eventually, the very thing you thought was protecting you begins draining you, because control demands endless energy. You cannot truly rest while trying to manage every unknown future. You cannot experience peace while emotionally gripping every outcome. You cannot hear God clearly while fear constantly shouts inside your thoughts. And maybe that is why surrender feels so difficult. Not because you do not love God, but because releasing control feels vulnerable. It feels risky, exposed, unsafe. Your mind immediately asks questions. What if things fall apart? What if God does not answer the way I hope? What if surrender leads to disappointment? What if letting go makes everything worse? Those fears feel real because control has become emotionally connected to safety. Even when control is exhausting you, part of your heart still believes it is necessary for survival. But there is something important you are beginning to understand now. Control has never actually given you peace. It only gave temporary illusion. Because even after all the overthinking, even after all the planning, even after all the worrying, you still could not fully secure tomorrow. Life remained uncertain anyway. That truth can feel uncomfortable because it exposes how limited human control truly is. No amount of anxiety can guarantee outcomes. No amount of fear can prevent every painful moment. No amount of mental effort can fully protect you from uncertainty. And maybe that realization is exactly where surrender begins. Not in confidence about the future, but in honesty about your limitations. You were never meant to carry the weight of omniscience. You were never designed to control every outcome. You were never created to sustain yourself emotionally through constant striving. Yet many people spend their entire lives trying, and slowly their souls become tired. Not because God failed them, but because self-dependence eventually crushes the human heart. That is why surrender is not weakness, it is wisdom. Surrender is finally recognizing that your need to control everything is not saving you. It is exhausting you. It is stealing your peace. It is keeping your mind trapped in fear-based survival instead of trust-filled relationship with God. But surrender still hurts at first, because releasing control feels like stepping into uncertainty without emotional protection. And this is where many people misunderstand faith. They think trust in God means never feeling afraid. But often trust begins while fear is still screaming inside your mind. Faith is not emotional perfection. Faith is choosing God's truth over your fearful need for certainty, even when your emotions resist it. That resistance can feel intense. Your mind wants reassurance immediately. Your emotions want visible evidence. Your fear wants guaranteed outcomes. But God often asks you to trust Him one step at a time instead. Not because He enjoys your discomfort, but because dependence grows where control weakens. And sometimes God allows situations you cannot fully manage because He is teaching your heart something deeper than self-sufficiency: dependence, real dependence. The kind that no longer treats prayer as a backup plan after anxiety fails, The kind that no longer approaches God only after emotional exhaustion becomes unbearable. The kind that rests in God's character, even before visible answers appear. That level of trust changes a person internally because now peace no longer depends entirely on circumstances. It begins flowing from a relationship instead of control. And although circumstances may still remain uncertain, your soul slowly stops living in constant panic. But getting there requires confrontation. You must confront the places where fear still rules your decisions, the areas you still refuse to release, the outcomes you secretly believe God may mishandle if you stop controlling them emotionally. That confrontation is deeply personal because everyone has something they struggle to surrender. For some, it is the future. For others, relationships, finances, health, purpose, timing, dreams, identity. The external details differ, but the internal battle remains the same. Can I trust God even when I cannot control the outcome? That question reveals where trust truly lives, because complete trust does not begin when life finally becomes predictable. It begins when you choose to believe God remains faithful even while uncertainty still exists, and that choice changes the heart slowly. At first, surrender feels unnatural because your mind has spent years rehearsing fear. But eventually you begin noticing something important. The tighter you grip control, the heavier life becomes. The more you surrender, the lighter your soul begins to feel. Not because every problem disappears immediately, but because you are no longer carrying them alone emotionally. That difference matters deeply. Many people believe surrender means becoming passive or careless, but biblical trust is not irresponsibility. It is releasing the emotional burden of trying to become your own source of security. You still act wisely. You still make decisions. You'll still pray, work, plan, and move forward. But internally, something changes. You stop treating yourself like the savior of your own life. And that shift brings freedom, because control creates constant pressure to perform perfectly. It convinces you that one mistake could ruin everything. It makes life feel fragile, because your security depends entirely on your ability to manage outcomes correctly. But surrender reminds you that God's faithfulness is bigger than your limitations, bigger than your fears, bigger than your mistakes, bigger than your uncertainty. And slowly, your relationship with Him begins changing. Prayer becomes less frantic. Your thoughts become less chaotic. Waiting becomes less threatening. Not because all the answers have arrived, but because you are no longer demanding complete control before allowing yourself to rest. That is what surrender ultimately does. It loosens fear's authority over your inner world. Fear may still speak sometimes. Uncertainty may still exist. Questions may still arise, but they no longer dominate your entire emotional life, because trust is slowly becoming stronger than control. And perhaps for the first time, you begin realizing something profound. God was never asking you to carry your future alone. He was asking you to walk with Him through it. That changes everything, because now the relationship becomes relational instead of transactional. You stop treating God merely as a source of solutions and begin learning how to rest in His presence even before solutions arrive. And strangely, that is where peace begins appearing. Not necessarily after circumstances change, but after your grip on control begins loosening. Still, another battle remains. Even after surrender begins, your emotions do not instantly become stable. Fear still returns sometimes. Doubts still appear. Anxiety still tries to reclaim your thoughts. So how do you continue trusting God when your emotions still feel inconsistent? One of the most difficult parts of trusting God is realizing that your emotions do not automatically change the moment you decide to have faith. You can surrender something to God in prayer and still feel anxious afterward. You can genuinely trust Him and still experience fear. You can believe truth while your emotions continue struggling to catch up, and that can feel discouraging. if you misunderstand what faith actually is. Because many people secretly believe faith should instantly erase emotional discomfort. They assume strong trust means never battling anxious thoughts again. So when fear returns, they think they are failing spiritually. But emotions are not always immediate indicators of spiritual truth. Feelings are real, but they are not always reliable. And perhaps that is one of the greatest internal battles you face every day, deciding whether your mind will follow fear or truth. Because fear speaks constantly. It speaks through imagined scenarios, through worst-case thinking, through emotional reactions, through memories of past disappointments. Fear says, what if things never change? What if this situation gets worse? What if God does not come through? What if you are alone in this? And if those thoughts repeat long enough, they begin shaping your emotional reality. That is why anxiety can feel so powerful. Repeated thoughts create emotional patterns. The mind moves in the direction it practices most. So if your thoughts constantly rehearse fear, your emotions naturally begin living in tension. This is why renewing the mind matters so deeply. Not because positive thinking solves everything, but because what you consistently believe internally shapes how you experience life spiritually and emotionally. For years, your mind may have been trained by fear, trained by disappointment, trained by uncertainty, trained by and now God is slowly teaching you a different way to think, a different way to interpret life, a different way to process uncertainty, a different way to respond to fear. But this process takes time because the mind does not instantly unlearn years of anxious thinking. That is why spiritual growth often feels repetitive at first. You surrender fear to God, and later fear tries to return. You pray for peace, and your mind still drifts toward worry. You choose trust, but emotions still fluctuate. That does not mean transformation is not happening. It means renewal is a process. And perhaps this is where many people give up too early. They expect emotional perfection immediately, instead of understanding that faithfulness is built daily, thought by thought, decision by decision. Every moment you redirect fear toward truth, something inside you strengthens, even if emotions lag behind temporarily. Because real faith is not measured by the complete absence of fear. It is measured by what you choose to believe when fear appears. Do you let fear become your authority? Or do you return your thoughts to God's truths again? That return matters deeply, especially because your thoughts shape the atmosphere of your inner world. If fear dominates your thinking constantly, peace will always feel distant. But if truth slowly becomes louder than fear, your emotional life begins changing over time. Not instantly, but steadily. And perhaps this is the shift you're beginning to experience now. You no longer want to live controlled by every anxious thought that enters your mind. You are tired of fear deciding your emotional state, tired of worst-case thinking controlling your peace, tired of feeling spiritually unstable every time uncertainty appears. So now you are learning something new. Thoughts must be examined, not automatically obeyed. That changes everything. Because not every fearful thought deserves agreement. Some thoughts come from fear, not truth. Some come from emotional exhaustion, not wisdom. Some come from old wounds, not God's voice. But when fear speaks repeatedly, it can start sounding convincing. That is why spiritual discernment matters internally as much as externally. You must learn to recognize the difference between thoughts rooted in fear and thoughts rooted in truth. Fear magnifies uncertainty. Truth reminds you of God's faithfulness. Fear tells you everything depends on you. Truth reminds you God has sustained you repeatedly. Fear says silence means abandonment. Truth says God remains present even when unseen. Fear demands immediate certainty. Truth teaches daily dependence. And slowly, through repeated surrender, your mind begins changing direction. You stop automatically spiraling every time uncertainty appears. You stop treating every delay like disaster. You stop assuming fear is prophecy, not because life suddenly becomes easy, but because your foundation is changing internally. That foundation matters more than most people realize. Because if your peace depends entirely on circumstances, life will always feel unstable. There will always be another challenge, another unknown future, another situation beyond your control. But when your mind becomes anchored in God's character instead of temporary emotions, something stronger than fear begins forming inside you. Stability, not emotional numbness, not pretending struggles do not exist, but deep internal stability rooted in trust. That stability changes how you pray. Prayer becomes less about panic and more about connection, less about demanding certainty and more about resting in God's presence. You stop approaching God only as a crisis manager. You begin approaching Him relationally. And that relationship slowly reshapes your inner world. Because the more time you spend focusing on God's character instead of your fears, the less authority fear holds over your thoughts. Anxiety may still visit, but it no longer controls the entire atmosphere of your mind. That does not happen accidentally. It happens through daily renewal, daily surrender, daily truth, daily decisions to trust God again. Sometimes, moment by moment, because faith is not usually built through one dramatic emotional breakthrough. More often, it is built quietly through repeated choices to trust God when fear still wants control. And perhaps that is where your transformation is becoming real now. Not because all your questions are answered, not because every emotion feels peaceful, but because your dependence is shifting. You are beginning to rely less on emotional certainty and more on God's faithfulness. That shift may feel small at first, but it changes everything over time. Because eventually you realize something powerful. You do not need to fully understand the future in order to trust the God who already sees it. That realization brings freedom. Freedom from needing constant reassurance. Freedom from obsessive overthinking. Freedom from treating uncertainty like an emergency. And strangely, as your thoughts begin aligning more with truth than fear, your emotional life slowly becomes lighter. Not perfect, but lighter. You start noticing moments of calm where panic once dominated, moments of peace during uncertainty, moments where your first reaction becomes prayer instead of spiraling mentally. That is growth, real growth. Not because fear never appears again, but because fear no longer rules you automatically. And perhaps for the first time in a long time, you begin realizing that trust in God is not fragile after all. It is becoming stronger quietly beneath the surface. Stronger than your emotions, stronger than your uncertainty, stronger than your need for control. And as that trust deepens, another realization slowly begins emerging. When you look back over your life honestly, you start seeing something you missed before. God has been sustaining you the entire time, even in seasons where you thought He was silent. When you look back honestly, you begin noticing something surprising. There were seasons you thought would completely destroy you. Moments where fear convinced you that you would not survive emotionally. Times where the future looked uncertain, confusing, and painfully unclear. And yet somehow, you kept moving forward. Not perfectly, not without struggle, not without tears, questions, or exhaustion, but you were sustained. At the time, you may not have recognized it. Fear often blinds people to the quiet ways God carries them. When anxiety dominates the mind, you focus so intensely on what might go wrong that you overlook the evidence of God's faithfulness already surrounding your life. But now, something inside you is beginning to shift. You are starting to see that God never abandoned you, even in seasons where He felt silent. He sustained you through heartbreak, through confusion, through waiting, through disappointment, through emotional exhaustion. Even when your faith felt weak, His faithfulness remained steady. That realization changes the relationship completely. Because for a long time, perhaps you measured God's presence mostly through visible outcomes. When prayers were answered quickly, you felt close to Him. When life made sense, trust felt easier. But during difficult seasons, you questioned everything. Now you are beginning to understand something deeper. God's faithfulness was never dependent on your emotional stability. He did not stay near only when your faith felt strong. He did not remain faithful only when your thoughts were peaceful. He did not stop carrying you every time fear entered your mind. He remained constant through all of it. And perhaps that truth softens your heart in a way nothing else could, because you finally realize you were never holding your life together as successfully as you thought. Control was never your true source of survival. God was. That realization can feel humbling. For years, fear convinced you that your constant mental effort was protecting you. But when you examine your life carefully, you start seeing how many times God sustained you beyond your own strength. Doors opened unexpectedly. Strength appeared when you thought you had none left. Peace arrived in moments that should have crushed you. Provision came in ways you could not have predicted. And even during seasons where answers delayed, God still carried you through each day. You survived things your fear once told you would destroy you. Not because you controlled everything correctly, but because God remained faithful while you were still learning how to trust Him. That changes the way you see your past. You stop viewing your entire life only through the lens of fear and disappointment. You begin recognizing evidence of God's quiet guidance woven throughout your story. Not dramatic perfection, not a life without pain, but consistent faithfulness. And suddenly, waiting no longer feels completely empty, because now you realize that even silence held purpose. The seasons where you thought God was absent were often seasons where He was building deeper dependence. Not dependence on outcomes, dependence on Him. That is a profound shift, because many people spend their lives treating God transactional. They trust Him when He provides immediate clarity, immediate comfort, immediate solutions. But relational trust grows differently. Relational trust deepens through presence, through consistency, through learning God's character over time. And perhaps that is what has truly been changing inside you lately. You are no longer only asking, "How can I escape uncertainty?" You are beginning to ask, "How can I walk with God through uncertainty?" That question reflects transformation, because now the relationship is becoming less about controlling outcomes and more about trust in the one walking beside you. That trust changes how you experience life internally. You stop panicking every time you cannot predict the future. You stop assuming silence means abandonment. You stop demanding immediate emotional certainty before allowing yourself to rest. Instead, your confidence slowly begins rooting itself somewhere deeper, not in perfect circumstances, not in complete understanding, but in God's consistent faithfulness. And once that foundation begins forming, fear loses some of its authority, not instantly, but gradually. Because now, whenever fear tries convincing you that everything depends entirely on you, you remember the countless moments God already carried you before. You remember the prayers He answered, the strength He provided, the doors He opened, the protection you did not even recognize at the time. And slowly, gratitude starts replacing some of the panic. Not because life suddenly becomes predictable, but because your perspective changes. You begin seeing your story differently. Instead of viewing yourself as someone barely surviving through constant control, you start recognizing yourself as someone continually sustained by grace. That realization removes enormous pressure from the soul, because if God has already carried you through so much, perhaps your future is not as fragile as fear keeps insisting. Perhaps you are safer in God's hands than in your own control. That thought creates peace internally, not shallow optimism. Not denial of difficulties, but deep reassurance rooted in God's character. And maybe, for the first time in a long time, your relationship with God starts feeling less exhausting. Prayer feels lighter. Silence feels less threatening. Waiting feels less hostile. Because now you understand something important. God's silence was never proof of abandonment. His delays were never proof of indifference. His timing was never evidence that He stopped caring. Many times, He was strengthening your trust beneath the surface, strengthening your ability to depend on Him instead of your own understanding. And although that process felt painful, it produced something valuable. You are no longer the same person you were before this journey began. Fear once controlled nearly every thought. Now truth interrupts fear. Control once dominated your emotional life. Now surrender is slowly teaching you peace. Uncertainty once felt unbearable. Now you are learning how to remain grounded even without all the answers. That transformation matters more than immediate comfort, because circumstances alone cannot create lasting peace. If external stability were enough, then every person with predictable circumstances would feel secure internally. But many still live anxious and exhausted because fear is ultimately a heart issue before it becomes a circumstance issue. And now God is healing that deeper place inside you, the place where fear once ruled. The place where control once felt necessary for survival. The place where uncertainty once instantly produced panic. Healing may still be ongoing, but transformation is already happening. You think differently now. You pray differently. No, you approach uncertainty differently now. Not perfectly, but differently. And perhaps the most beautiful shift of all is this. You are slowly learning that trust in God is not merely believing He can change your circumstances. It is believing He remains faithful, even while circumstances remain uncertain. That kind of trust creates stability. No external situation can fully destroy, because now your peace is no longer entirely attached to outcomes. It is becoming attached to God Himself. And once that happens, something incredible begins taking place. The future stops feeling like a threat you must constantly control. You begin walking forward one step at a time. Instead, not because you suddenly possess all the answers, but because you trust the God who already does. And that trust changes the atmosphere of your entire inner world. Fear still appears sometimes, but it no longer owns you. Questions still exist, but they no longer consume you. Uncertainty still remains, but it no longer destroys your peace completely. Because somewhere along the way, your relationship with God stopped being built only on immediate results. It became rooted in trust. And once trust becomes deeper than fear, a new kind of peace finally begins emerging. Not the peace of perfect circumstances, but the peace of knowing you no longer have to carry your entire life alone. There is a kind of peace that only appears after a person finally stops trying to carry what was never theirs to control. Not because life suddenly becomes easy, not because every prayer is immediately answered, not because uncertainty completely disappears, but because something inside finally changes. The constant striving begins slowing down. The endless mental pressure begins loosening. The fear that once dominated every thought no longer controls the entire heart. And perhaps this is what you are finally discovering now. Trusting God completely does not mean you will never face storms again. It means the storm no longer defines your inner world the way it once did. Before, uncertainty consumed you. Now, uncertainty still exists, but it no longer owns you. Before, silence felt terrifying. Now, silence feels different because you understand God can still be present even when unseen. Before, waiting felt like punishment. Now, you recognize waiting can also become a place where trust grows stronger. That transformation is deeply powerful because it changes the way you experience life itself. You wake up differently. You pray differently. You think differently. Not perfectly, not fearlessly, but peacefully in a way you could not access before, because your peace is no longer built entirely on outcomes. It is built on trust, and trust changes everything internally. When fear rises, you no longer automatically believe every anxious thought. When uncertainty appears, you no longer immediately panic. When life feels unclear, you no longer assume God has abandoned you. Instead, something steadier begins holding your heart together. The memory of God's faithfulness, the awareness of His presence, the growing confidence that you do not have to carry tomorrow before it arrives. That realization brings rest to the soul. Rest. Not temporary emotional escape, not denial of reality, but deep spiritual stability, the kind that remains, even while challenges still exist. Because now you understand something many people spend years trying to learn. Peace does not come from controlling life. Peace comes from trusting God within life. That truth frees you from an exhausting way of living. You stop obsessing over every possible future outcome. You'll stop treating uncertainty like an emergency. You stop carrying emotional burdens that only God was meant to hold. And perhaps most importantly, you stop believing that everything depends entirely on you. That pressure begins leaving your heart. The pressure to have every answer. The pressure to never make mistakes. The pressure to force clarity before it's time. The pressure to mentally control every unknown future. You realize now that control was never giving you life. It was draining it. And although surrender once felt terrifying, it slowly became the doorway to freedom. Because surrender did not make you weaker. It made you dependent on the right source, God, the one who sees what you cannot see, the one who remains faithful when your emotions fluctuate, the one who continues guiding you, even during seasons where understanding feels incomplete. And now, for the first time in a long time, your relationship with him feels less transactional. You are no longer constantly asking, how do I make life feel safe again? Instead, your heart is learning to say, God, walk with me through whatever comes. That is real trust. Not because fear never whispers again, but because fear is no longer the loudest voice inside you. Faith has become stronger, quietly, steadily, deeply. And perhaps that is the miracle you were actually searching for all along. Not immediate perfection, not a life free from struggle, but transformation within the struggle. Because complete trust in God does not always remove the storm immediately. It transforms the person walking through it. Now, when uncertainty appears, you remember that God has already sustained you through countless moments before. When fear tries returning, you'll remember that control never truly protected you anyway. When silence comes, you remember that God still works in hidden places. And when the future feels unclear, you remember that you do not need to see the entire path to trust the one leading you. That perspective changes how you move forward from this moment. You begin taking life one step at a time. Instead of trying to mentally survive years all at once, you begin praying with honesty instead of panic, resting instead of striving, trusting instead of obsessing, and slowly your soul becomes lighter. Not because responsibilities disappear, but because you stop carrying them alone emotionally. That is what happens when you finally trust God completely. Fear loses authority, control loosens its grip, peace becomes possible again. And perhaps the most beautiful part is that this peace is no longer fragile. Before, your peace depended on circumstances behaving correctly. Now, your peace is becoming rooted in God's unchanging character. Circumstances still change. People still disappoint. Life still remains uncertain at times. But God remains faithful through all of it. And once your heart truly begins believing that, something settles deeply inside you. You no longer need constant reassurance every moment. You no longer need immediate answers to survive emotionally. You no longer need to understand everything before allowing yourself to breathe, because trust has replaced the exhausting need to control. That does not happen overnight. It happens through daily surrender, daily prayer, daily choices to return your thoughts to truth instead of fear. Some days will still feel difficult. Some moments will still test your faith. Some seasons will still require patience. But now you know something you did not fully understand before. You are not walking through life alone. God has been with you in every silent season, every fearful moments, every unanswered prayer, every exhausting night where your mind refused to rest, and He will continue walking with you into every unknown future ahead. So today, you can finally release what fear has convinced you to carry alone for far too long. You can stop fighting for control that never truly gave you peace. You can breathe again. You can rest again. Not because you suddenly know everything about the future, but because you trust the God who already does. If this message spoke to your heart, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments what area of your life you are learning to surrender to God. And remember this, quietly as you move forward, the moment you stop trying to carry everything alone may become the very moment your soul finally learns what peace feels like.